Good evening. Welcome to our third presentation in the 2020 American Dream Reconsidered Conference. 75 years of social justice, the history of Roosevelt University. Our celebration of Roosevelt University's 75th anniversary is highlighted this evening with a presentation by a Professor Emerita of History and my good friend, Dr. Lynn Weiner, a former Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and historian of the university. Professor Weiner has spent innumerable hours working in the Roosevelt University archives, conducting oral histories and collecting documentation on the history of our path-breaking institution. Her article on this topic, entitled Pioneering Social Justice, was published in the summer 2019 edition of Chicago History. Her scholarly work has appeared in a number of journals, and her book, From Working Girl to Working Mother, was itself a pioneering study in the field of women's history. Tonight, she brings her considerable expertise and enthusiasm to the history of Roosevelt University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynn Weiner.
Thank you. I'm excited to welcome you to Roosevelt University as we celebrate our 75th anniversary, and welcome to our 5th annual conference on the American Dream Reconsidered. Tonight, we will explore Roosevelt's remarkable story as an institution shaped by a deep commitment to democracy, social justice, and human rights. Roosevelt's history is a story of the American dream. Next slide, please. The university is named for Eleanor as well as Franklin Roosevelt, and she was with us at the beginning, bringing her optimism and idealism and deep belief in human rights to everything she did as she met with Roosevelt students, raised funds, and served as chair of our first advisory board. In 1947, she said, "Roosevelt College proves that democracy works when tried." But let's go back to the start when you see this next slide. In the mid-1940s, Americans were challenged by a world war, the end of a long economic depression, and systemic racism. Sound familiar? Today, we face a trifecta of a global pandemic, economic crisis, and systemic racism. But we can learn from the people who founded Roosevelt College, from their optimism, their activism, and their belief in the power of democracy. Most colleges in the 1940s were open primarily to white male Protestants. America's caste system at that time determined who could get higher education and where. Many schools did not admit women and restricted the numbers of Jewish, Black, Asian, Latino, and even Catholic applicants. Admissions quotas were meant to restrict the number of socially undesirable students, and they were enforced at universities throughout the country, including Northwestern, the University of Chicago, and Loyola. Their application forms often asked for photographs, the birthplace of parents, the birthplace of grandparents, the language spoken at home, and race and religion. There were few non-restricted choices for higher education in the Chicago area. Often, the only choice was the Chicago Central YMCA College, which admitted everyone, no matter who they were. But in the early 1940s, the Chicago Central YMCA College decided there were too many Jewish, Japanese, and Black students and ordered the president to provide demographic information so that they could restrict admissions. Next slide. That president at the time was Edward Jim Sparling. He had come to the Y College in 1936. He was shocked to find that Black students paid a mandatory recreation fee, but were not allowed to use the swimming pool or to attend school dances in segregated hotels. The college directors refused to change the rules, saying that their members would be offended. So President Sparling suspended all physical education, sports, and dances until they could become equally accessible. When told by the governing board of the YMCA College to count the numbers of Black, Jewish, and Japanese students, he responded, "We don't count that way." And he went on to say that every student is regarded as a human being and not put in a racial category. It was an act of courage to refuse the direction of the college advisors and trustees. As you'll see in the next slide, it wasn't only admission restrictions that impelled Sparling and the faculty to protest. The YMCA College Board also wanted to oversee what was being taught in the classroom. Faculty, they said, should not teach controversial, partisan, or faction-breeding issues, such as the labor movement, religion, or race. At one point, they planned to have overseers in the classrooms to assure that faculty complied. The faculty, as you can imagine, was having none of this. Also, the Faculty Executive Committee, on Sparling's recommendation, published a book on racial prejudice in 1944, further enraging the board. The ABCs of Scapegoating by Harvard psychologist Gordon Allport couldn't find a publisher, although eventually the book was picked up by the Anti-Defamation League and in print through the 1980s. Finally, as you'll see before he could be fired in the next slide, on April 17th, 1945, Sparling resigned. The next day, in a walkout unique in American higher education, 62 faculty and staff joined him in protest of the illiberal and discriminatory practices of the YMCA. They endorsed the creation of a new, more democratic college instead. The next day, the students gathered and enthusiastically voted to follow the president and faculty. Lily Sachs Rose, a student who was a refugee from Nazi Germany, was at that meeting. I interviewed her about 10 years ago, and she remembered being totally caught up in the idea of what was possible in this country. She said, "To have this experiment in education, it didn't matter what color you were, your religion, or the shape of your eyes. I can't imagine anything else in my life that was so exciting or so large." The new college at first was to be named for Thomas Jefferson, but when FDR died in April of 1945, the college leaders contacted Eleanor Roosevelt for permission to name the school for him. Starting with no endowment and no funds, the founders sought donations, arguing that knowledge is essentially democratic and universal. It knows no borders, boundaries, color, creed, or culture. They quickly raised $500,000, which is about $7 million today, with support from Marshall Field III, labor unions, the Rosenwald Foundation, the Pritzker Foundation, and hundreds more donors, both large and small. Eleanor Roosevelt also agreed to head the first advisory board. In November 15, 1945, she dedicated Roosevelt College to the enlightenment of the human spirit through the constant search for truth, and to the growth of the human spirit through knowledge, understanding, and goodwill. Next slide. Rededicated in 1959, at which time we became a university instead of a college, the new name honored Eleanor as well as Franklin Roosevelt, and we are the only educational institution in the world named for both Roosevelts. Now we're going to see a picture of the first student meeting at this new school, which was housed initially in a remodeled office building on Wells Street. 1,200 students from 40 states and 15 countries began classes in September of 1945. If you look carefully at this picture, you can see the remarkable diversity of the college during a time of intense racial segregation in Chicago. The surprise, at least to me, was the number of Japanese students. And it turns out that President Sparling actively recruited students who had spent the war years in Japanese internment camps. One journalist reported that Roosevelt College is not like any college you ever saw. As you wander down the corridors and peer into the classrooms, you observe all races and colors. And one of the founding professors described the students as the most challenging, the most argumentative, the most alert I have ever had. It is the feeling of their rights as persons which makes so many of them wish to question or add to a discussion. In the next slide, you'll see the first issue of the college newspaper, which was soon to be named The Torch. This issue included news of the dedication by Eleanor Roosevelt, a welcome by President Sparling, an announcement of a speaker series featuring the founding professors. Sparling told the students in his welcome that we have an opportunity unique in the history of education, an opportunity to hold high the light of freedom. Below the fold on the front page is a letter from a student, Warren Marks, written to his parents on why he chose to go to Roosevelt. It was, he said, because Roosevelt can become whatever the students and teachers want it to be. I hope that Roosevelt will help students help society and not just emphasize the mere badges and symbols of achievement. In the next slide, you can see how Roosevelt, which quickly outgrew its first campus because thousands more wanted to attend, found a new building. It was hard to find a new campus, as many Chicago property owners in the 1940s refused to sell to a racially integrated institution. But the auditorium building was available. A landmark created by Louis Sullivan and Denkmar Adler in 1889, it was the first multiple-use structure in the country and had been a celebrated and glamorous hotel with an 8-story business tower and a magnificent 4,200-seat theater. But by the 1940s, it had fallen into bankruptcy. The next pictures show you what the building originally looked like. Here you can see the theater on my upper left, the banquet recital hall, which is now Gans Hall on the 7th floor, the fabulous hotel lobby, which was considered one of the most beautiful in the United States, and the restaurant, which took the entire 10th floor, which is now our library. The theater, which opened in 1889, was to be an expression of American democracy, bringing art and culture to working people as well as to the wealthy, with good views and good acoustics, even in the cheapest seats and upper balconies. The Chicago Symphony, the opera, various speakers, even indoor baseball games and a circus took the stage. However, the theater was racially segregated, with Black patrons relegated to the 4th balcony, a common practice in American theaters. And originally, the hotel was gender segregated. Look again at that lobby. There was a woman's entrance at the south end, a woman's cafe, and an oak-paneled bar for men along what is now Ida B. Wells Parkway. There were women's entrances to the theater, and what is now the Sullivan Room on the 2nd floor was a women's parlor, and what is now the Spurtis Lounge on the 2nd floor was a gentleman's smoking room. Next, we'll see some current photos of the building. Again, the acoustically perfect theater. Gans Hall, which Roosevelt now uses for rehearsals, performances, and lectures. And the 3rd floor landing, which I include because you can see the original beautiful stained glass of the building and the tile work and the ironwork. And then, of course, the 10th floor student library, which replaced the restaurant. Thankfully, racial and gender segregation have vanished in this building. During World War II, you will see in the next picture, the building, largely decayed, became a social center for the military. The stained glass was boarded up, tiled floors and woodwork were painted over. The 10th floor became an enlisted men's barracks, and Gans Hall was used as an officer's barracks. And in the next picture, you will see that the theater stage became a bowling alley. Roosevelt bought the building in 1946, and as you will see in the next picture, the first faculty, staff, and students worked hard to clean it up at what were called spit and polish parties. They helped to convert the old hotel into a college with classrooms, labs, and offices in time for fall 1947 classes. Over 5,000 students registered that first semester in the auditorium building. They were recent high school graduates, along with many military veterans returned from the war. And now I'd like to introduce you to some of the founding faculty. The faculty were as diverse as the students. At a time when most American professors were white male Protestants, at Roosevelt, there were men and women, African Americans, Jewish and Catholic academics, and teachers from India, China, and Latin America. There were many refugees from war-torn Europe, including a business professor named Rolf Weil, who became Roosevelt's third president. They were also diverse politically, with a liberal caucus and a conservative caucus. But, as one professor wrote, at Roosevelt College, they were united in the belief that freedom from fear is here, and freedom of speech is here, and freedom of assembly is here. In this slide, we see Francis Horowitz, an education professor who founded one of the first children's TV shows, Ding Dong School, which you can actually watch on YouTube for an excruciating half hour as she shows children how to make a sandwich. We have the distinguished economist, Abba Lerner, and the modern dancer, Sybil Shearer, who is considered one of the first dancers to tackle spiritual and social justice issues in her work. In the next slide, we see Ruth Barkin Marcus, a philosopher known for her pioneering work in logic, and she ended her career at Yale. Edward Chandler, the second African American to earn a PhD in chemistry, taught at Roosevelt from 1945 until his retirement in 1965. And Dale Brenes was a modern language professor born in Costa Rica, who later went to Cornell. And of course, there's more. In the next slide, you see Lorenzo Turner. He is a linguist who wrote about the persistence of African folklore and language in the Gullah culture of South Carolina. And he was also the first Black professor to be hired on a full-time tenure track at a white majority institution. He also co-founded a training program for Peace Corps volunteers going to Africa. Rose Hum Lee was the first Chinese American woman to earn a doctorate in sociology in the United States and the first to chair a sociology department. And probably our most famous professor in the early years was St. Clair Drake. He co-wrote a book called Black Metropolis, which is still taught today. And our Drake Center is named for him. It supports lectures, research, and the Black Male Leadership Academy. And we'll have a bit more on that later. Next, we'll see the trustees, who are also part of this pioneering spirit of inclusion. The first vice chair was Percy Julian, an African-American chemist, and he may have been the first Black trustee of a majority white college in the country. He was also the first Black chemist elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Roosevelt was also the first to mandate a wide inclusion and representation from such groups as labor, capital, management, cooperatives, the press, the faculty, and later, students. The college staff, who you'll see in the next slide, was also remarkably diverse from the very beginning. Alice Pascoe was a psychologist and became head of the Counseling and Testing Center, working at Roosevelt from its very beginning until her death in 1975. Edwin Turner was the first Black coach of an integrated college team, and he oversaw athletics at Roosevelt from 1946 until 1981. He coached everything from basketball and soccer to golf and ping pong and bowling. And when he coached golf, he wasn't allowed into the country clubs where his team played. And Mary Sonoda was recruited to Roosevelt by President Sparling after she was released from a wartime Japanese internment camp. She became the executive secretary to 3 Roosevelt presidents. Now we'll look at some of the friends of Roosevelt University. And we've had some amazing people come to campus, from Martin Luther King, who was honored at Roosevelt in 1957 for his civil rights work, to Albert Einstein, who was on our first advisory board, and Oprah Winfrey, who received an honorary degree in 2000, shown here with finance major Beverly Lockhart. You may wonder, why Albert Einstein on the advisory board? Well, in addition to being probably the most famous physicist, he was also a civil rights activist who once called racism America's worst disease. Other speakers, awardees, and visitors over the years have included vice presidents, Nobel Prize winners, Supreme Court justices, civil rights leaders, senators, performers, and 3 Roosevelts: Eleanor, her son John, who was a trustee, and her granddaughter and namesake, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, who was also a trustee. More recently, we'll see in the next slide, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg spoke at the 2017 American Dream Conference to a sold-out auditorium theater. And by the way, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor is scheduled to speak at our conference next year in September of 2021. Also, you'll see in the next slide, Hillary Rodham Clinton was awarded Roosevelt University's first Eleanor Roosevelt Social Justice Award in 2017. She's shown here with our board chair. And we'll see in our next slide that with all of these things, Roosevelt College became the subject of numerous newspaper and magazine articles for several years, with headlines like "A Model of Democracy and Education," "An Edifice Devoted to Truth," and "Chicago's Equality Lab." Reporters finished classrooms and students and expressed great astonishment at the inclusion of the university, publishing their observations in the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, Time Magazine, and many more. But, as we'll see in the next slide, at the same time, in the late 1940s and 1950s, when we were getting all this press, it was a time of the Red Scare, and many colleges and universities across the country mandated that faculty and staff sign loyalty oaths indicating they were patriots and not members of the Communist Party. Students getting national defense loans for college had to do the same through the late 1960s, but not at Roosevelt. This was a place where difference of opinion was valued. Conservative, liberal, and radical voices were heard. The first yearbooks show some 30 student organizations from the late 1940s, including a chess club, a Zionist federation, an American League for a Free Palestine, a social action training group, a business club, a charm school, the League of Women Voters, and yes, a communist club with 2 members. Students from Roosevelt and the University of Chicago traveled to Springfield to object to the loyalty oaths, and the Illinois Seditious Activities Committee, in turn, voted to investigate both schools for subversion. The committee prepared a 300,000-word report that acknowledged there was none. The New Republic reported that the only subversive activity at Roosevelt College is democracy, real democracy, the kind you can live, not the kind you just talk. And what you see here, if you can see these, there's the state legislature report on how they were going to do the investigation, and then an alumni letter protesting it. For years, Roosevelt was sometimes labeled the Little Red Schoolhouse. Next, we'll look a little bit at our curriculum. The curriculum reflected our commitment to inclusion and social justice. In the first decades, our pioneering labor education program educated more than 10,000 labor union members from 50 unions. Our clerical staff was the first in the Chicago area to be unionized. Our Murray Green Library on the 10th floor was named for 2 labor leaders in 1963. And next, we can see how classes in a variety of fields were also shaped by the mission of civic engagement. But education at Roosevelt was never confined to the classroom. By the late 1940s, and you can see this in the bottom to my left picture, interdisciplinary conferences and institutes on topics ranging from African studies, public health, and community organization were held. In this picture, you see President Sparling sitting in the middle. On one side is Frank Untermeyer, political science professor, and the other is St. Clair Drake. And they're planning an early institute on Africa. Above, of course, is St. Clair Drake teaching a course on race in Chicago in the more traditional way. To the right is a field trip into the city by a sociology professor. And then beneath that is the cafeteria. I include the cafeteria because it was a hotbed for debate and discussion, often with professors, and often classes didn't end when the time ended, but they spilled out into the cafeteria. Jacques Paul Klein, a history major who later became a US diplomat, remembered the cafeteria, in his words, as the focal point for our debates, arguments, and critiques, but most importantly, camaraderie. Who could not help but be enriched by such a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, and diverse student body? Turning now to our students. Our students, as you will see in a minute, were engaged in all kinds of activities from the start. But I love these publicity photos, one from the 1940s and one very recent. Aside from the dress code change, what you see is a continuation of diversity of our students. So let's start with one of our most famous alums, and that's Harold Washington. He was the president of the student government. You can see him at the far end of the table, also taking a nap during summer school, and I bet you that those are cots left over from when the military was in the building. He graduated from Roosevelt, became a lawyer, and then a US congressman, and then in 1983, the first Black mayor of Chicago. When asked how he came to be mayor, he said, "Go down to Roosevelt and visit the students. I'm like them." Next, we'll see how many students went on to careers as community organizers and activists. This is James Foreman, another student government president, who was later the National Secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a group central to the Civil Rights Freedom Riders, marches, and sit-ins of the 1960s. He transferred to Roosevelt after he was at the University of California and beaten up by the police for a crime he did not commit. Next, we have someone who's not a social activist, but I think a lot of students would know him, Shel Silverstein. He began his career as a cartoonist for the student newspaper, The Torch. And here you see one of his cartoons. He went on to study both English and music, and then he wrote and illustrated such great children's books as The Giving Tree and Light in the Attic and Where the Sidewalk Ends. As a music student, he also went on to write many songs and won a Grammy for one of them, A Boy Named Sue. And here are some more of our 120,000 alumni. Lorraine Hansberry. She was the author of the play Racing in the Sun, of course, and she came to Roosevelt for summer school. Denitra Vance, a theater major, was the first Black woman on Saturday Night Live. Goldie Wolf, a real estate entrepreneur, now funds scholarships for women in our real estate program. And medical researcher and scientist Paul Silverman helped to found the Human Genome Project at the University of California. Next, we see Sam Ozaki, who won a Purple Heart during World War II and studied education at Roosevelt, becoming the first Asian principal in the Chicago public schools. He was also a leader in the struggle for reparations for the Japanese Americans who lost their property during wartime relocation. Tim Black, who is now, by the way, 101 years old, was also a war hero and has had a long career as a writer, historian, social worker, and civil rights activist. He helped to organize the 1963 March on Washington with Martin Luther King Jr. Jacques Paul Klein, who you met earlier in the cafeteria, after retiring as a Major General of the Air Force, entered the U.S. Foreign Service in 1971 and led 3 peacekeeping missions for the United Nations. Next, we have more. Bobby Raymond used her MA thesis in sociology at Roosevelt as the framework to found the Oak Park Housing Center, which still today advocates for housing diversity. Jennifer Hawes, a political science and journalism major, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and also the author of a recent book on the 2015 Charleston Church massacres. And Professor Darlene Clark Hine, a founder of the field of Black women's history, taught at Michigan State and Northwestern and also on occasion at Roosevelt, and is a recipient of the National Humanities Medal. Next, we have Elida DePaula, who graduated in piano from the Chicago College of Performing Arts and now leads a nonprofit organization bringing community access to music in Berwyn. Richard Torres is an award-winning journalist, and Annie Warshaw, the co-founder and leader of a gender equity consulting firm. We have also educated Maurice Smith, president of Healthcare Services Corporation, Carla Hayden, the newest Librarian of Congress, and actually she was also the head of the Chicago Public Library earlier than that, and Pat Harris, former VP of McDonald's and our current chair of the Board of Trustees, and the first woman and African American to hold that post. Numerous Roosevelt alumni are politicians in state and local communities, including the Illinois State Legislature, and then several of them also from our recent alumni from Robert Morris University. We also claim 7 members of the US Congress, most recently Melissa Bean, Mike Quigley, and Bobby Rush, and all 3 of them have been to Roosevelt frequently, either to talk or in meetings and to meet students. Finally, our most recent alumni include people like Peter Rubenstein, who went with his journalism class to Flint, Michigan to report on the water crisis there, and is now a project editor for the BBC. Ramuel Figuera, who was one of the Chicago area students selected to participate in the panel with then President Barack Obama, is now a student at the University of Wisconsin Law School. Janine Webbe, who teaches in Chicago, recently won the Golden Apple Award for Excellence in Teaching, and that's a national award. And finally, business administration graduate Nicole Wilson is a data management associate at the University of Chicago Urban Labs. Roosevelt students have pioneered in activism of all kinds, continuing the legacy of 1945. In the 1950s, they created Discrimination Day, or D-Day, role-playing what discrimination would be like for such physical attributes as hair color or weight. In the next slide, you see another example of this, although I don't know that they get away with weighing people anymore as an attribute. But Roosevelt students doing this, in Ebony magazine called it a prank with a purpose. D-Day also barred access to the library, elevators, or 3rd and 7th floors to blondes, short women, men with mustaches, or people with freckles. In the next slide, we see another example of this early activism. Beta Sigma Tau, the first national fraternity integrated by race and religion, was founded at Roosevelt in the late 1940s. It merged with Pi Lambda Phi in 1960, and I don't think that Roosevelt currently has a chapter, but many universities do. The students in this photo are not only from Roosevelt, but from Union College, Ohio State, Marietta College, and Ohio Wesleyan University. Even school dances had a meaning at Roosevelt. Our students loved dances. In the early years, there was the Cranberry Hop, the President's Birthday Ball, Homecoming, the Final Fling, and many more. The thing was, even these dances had an important meaning because they were racially segregated, something that wasn't done at most places in the 1940s and 50s. So what could be seen as just fun also had a purpose. As did, by the way, Chicago's Jazz Showcase, which began in 1947 when student Joe Siegel worked with fellow students Bennett Johnson and Gus Savage to bring jam sessions to the 2nd floor lounge. These brought white and black performers and audiences together. And just as a side note, Joe sadly died this last August at the age of 94. And of course, there's more. Roosevelt students took part in the protest against racial injustice in many different ways. The big photograph here is at White City, which was a roller rink on the South Side. And in 1949, Roosevelt students joined a protest because Black students weren't allowed to roller skate. Students also picketed hotels, stores, and restaurants that discriminated. And they voted to exclude the Red Cross from campus because the Red Cross at that time segregated blood donations. Black plasma was to go to Black people and white to white people, and the students were having no part of that. They also took part in social action training with professors to protest discrimination in real estate. In the 1960s, next, the students spoke out in protests, as students did across the country, against atomic bomb testing, and also in protest against the military draft and the war in Indochina. And these pictures are all either inside or outside the auditorium building. Student activists also worked on issues ranging from Black studies to women's liberation. African American history and culture had been taught at Roosevelt from the very beginning and had been a subject of the interdisciplinary institutes. But by the early 1970s, the Black Students Association argued for a separate department. Today, there is an interdisciplinary BA and minor in African American Studies. The Chicago Women's Liberation Union also held meetings at Roosevelt, where there was a college chapter. And women's studies here were offered by the early 1970s, which was pretty early nationally. Today, Roosevelt offers an interdisciplinary BA and a minor in women's and gender studies. Next slide. For 40 years, the Roosevelt community has advocated for LGBTQ issues. In 1972, the student newspaper published a full-page article on gay militancy. The AIDS memorial quilt was displayed in the second floor lounge in the late 1980s. In 2003, Roosevelt President Charles Middleton, the first openly gay university president in the United States, was recognized for his work on behalf of LGBTQ students by the city of Chicago. Roosevelt was a host of the Chicago Gay Games in 2006, and the Center for Arts Leadership sponsored the performance of Considering Matthew Shepard in 2019, one of the first in the country to have that performance. For years, Are You Proud has been Roosevelt's gender and sexual minority and ally organization. And the 75-year tradition of peaceful protest still engages many of our students, as you'll see in the next slide. Here we see just a few of the many protests that our students have been active in. The top slide shows national walkout day to protest gun violence in 2018, and that's taking place just across the street from the auditorium building. There was the 2017 Chicago Women's March. In July 2020, the protest against immigration policies and restrictions on international students included Roosevelt students who were cited in the Chicago Tribune. And of course, the Black Lives Matter Summer 2020 protests included many of our students. This next photo shows a group called RISE, which was very active in student gatherings to advocate for student grants and loans, which is, after all, a critical part of equal access to education. And many of our students are passionate about the environment. They take part in a student organization called Roosevelt Green. And they take courses in sustainability. In the bottom picture with the canoe, that I believe is a political science course offered last year on politics and the environment. And on top, you can see our president, President Melexide, working with students in our rooftop gardens in the Wabash building. The Wabash building is a 32-story vertical campus with 8,000 square feet of roof plants, and it has won various awards for sustainability. And a final example of student activism is Jasmine Cruz, an education major who organized the most recent Women's March in Chicago. Last year, she was awarded the first Illinois Human Rights Commission Millennial Activism Award. Today, opportunities abound for social justice engagement through classes and majors, but also with lectures and projects and events of our centers and institutes and student organizations. Listed here are some of the organizations, many of them funded by generous donors and alumni, and their work wouldn't be possible without them. We have the Center for Arts Leadership, the Center for New Deal Studies, the Gage Gallery, which, well, I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, the Joseph Lowndes Human Rights Project, the Mansfield Institute for Social Justice and Transformation, the Montesquieu Forum, which brings philosophers from around the country to Roosevelt, the St. Clair Drake Center, and the Women's Leadership Council. Roosevelt was also the first university in the Chicago area to develop majors in social justice studies and sustainability studies. And of course, our annual conference on the American Dream, Reconsidered, has brought thousands of people to debate and discuss and listen to matters of couldn't be more important. We also have 50 student organizations of various kinds, so students can find, like in the old days, students can find a variety of options. Next slide, please. And just to show you a few pictures of these, in the upper left, we have the Black Male Leadership Academy, which is one of the many projects of the St. Clair Drake Center. The Gage Gallery features documentary photography with an emphasis on social justice, ranging with recently staging exhibits on topics like immigration detention, civil rights history, and Chicago street memorials. In the picture bottom left, you see Pulitzer Prize winner James Forman Jr., the son of our alumni James Forman, who presented the annual Mansfield Lecture last year on crime and punishment in Black America. And in the nifty uniform, we have Regina Benjamin, at that time the Surgeon General of the United States, who was the Center for New Deal Studies speaker in 2010 when she spoke about public health. Finally, the Joseph Lowndes Human Rights Project has recently focused on environmental justice as well as a variety of other topics, as they organize internships for students and teach comparative human rights in the US and abroad. And these are just a few of many of the activities that we're talking about. All of our colleges have integrated human rights and social justice into their programs. For example, the College of Pharmacy is now a site for the HIV curriculum project. Next slide, please. And the Chicago College of Performing Arts has asked of its students, what should social justice look like to performing artists in the 21st century? Here are some of the ways. Through courses, this is percussion professor Paul Wertico, a Grammy-winning artist, has taught classes on music, culture, and protest. The university has given seed grants for various projects through the Center for Arts Leadership and community engagement of various kinds. And these are just some of the examples. Classes at the university in recent years have included a journalism class with Professor John Fountain, who's there talking to the guy holding the water bottles, investigating the water crisis in Flint. Professor Fountain also took his class in 2019 to learn how to report the news at a rally for gun safety legislation in Washington, D.C. Next, we see some of the study abroad classes. Study abroad classes were designed for students who couldn't afford the time or the money to take a full semester or two abroad. And instead, they were shaped so that an entire class could travel together for a week or two. These courses often reflect our social justice mission, like the sociology class, which studied racial diversity in South Africa, or the biology class, which studied poverty and conservation in Tanzania, or the political science class, which visited Amsterdam to study public policy. We also have more traditional study abroad classes on Shakespeare or marketing or music, which also broaden the experience of our students. I included the picture above on the student exchange with Sussex University. The two young women are from England, and the young man is from Roosevelt, and they each went to each other's university. We have a number of those in Australia and in England and other places where students can study, and also, of course, through more traditional ways as well. Next, please. Our recent integration with Robert Morris University, an institution with a proud tradition of its own of inclusion and equity, has brought us a new leader at the Schaumburg campus, Maybelline Kruger, shown here with President Ali Malekzadeh. And now we're going to end as we began, with words from Eleanor Roosevelt. But first, I hope you've seen at least a little how Roosevelt University was a pioneer in so many ways related to social justice, community engagement, and the creation of leadership. We are 75 years old, young in terms of most national universities, and yet we have had an outside impact on the world. If the American dream is about anything, it is about opportunity and education unfettered by bigotry and hate, and Roosevelt has embodied that from the beginning. For any students who may be watching, and maybe for everyone, How will you honor our mission of inclusion and democracy? How can you be part of the legacy? One way is to vote on November 3rd if you're eligible, but above all, to find work that you love and a life of civic engagement. As Eleanor Roosevelt told our students in 1947, it isn't enough to be against something, you have to be for something with real feeling. So thank you for listening. Now, I'd like to welcome my fellow historian, Margaret Rung, who is a professor of history at Roosevelt and also director of the Center for New Deal Studies.
Hi, Lynn. That was tremendous. Thank you for sharing that. Hi, everyone. I'm here to moderate the Q&A portion of our session this evening. And I must say, just to start off, I have to say this. You know, as somebody who has worked with you for so many years, Lynn, and I'm a little bit biased because Lynn hired me, you represent Roosevelt, and I've always felt that you live the mission, and working for you was very evident that you took it very seriously. You were sincere in your efforts to steer the university in the right direction and to work with faculty and students to do so. So I have a lot of gratitude for all of the work that you put in making this university what it is today. So thank you.
I love Roosevelt, and I
know you do.
So many people, you know.
I know you do, and it's infectious. It's infectious. We have a few questions, so I'm gonna ask those. I have a couple of my own, but we'll just sort of see where the conversation takes us. And the first one is actually from a former colleague of ours, Michael Durnell.
Oh, hi, Michael.
Hi, Michael. So Michael is asking kind of an interesting question, which I don't know the answer to. Is it true that in the original president's office that there were some carvings in the woodwork and glass from GIs? Now, I don't know where that original president's office was. Was it on the 8th floor or?
It was on the 8th floor, and that's a great question, and I don't know, and I'm going to find out, and I'll let you know, Michael.
I know. I don't know if that's one of those urban legends or.
But there's usually a grain of truth in a lot of those, and I know someone who might know the answer, so I'll try to find out.
Okay. All right. Yeah, those I have to say, Michael, that's one of those questions that history teachers, professors dread. You know, when a student asks such a specific question, factually or any question, and you're sort of caught, don't know. All right, question from Spencer. He wants to know, how does Roosevelt stay true to its social justice mission? And I think this is a good question. Has it become more difficult over time?
I don't think it's become more difficult. I think one thing that's happened is that a lot of places have caught up with Roosevelt. So we're no longer the place where newspaper reporters come to wonder at all the inclusion and the sense of democracy, which, by the way, came directly, I'm sure, from the experience of World War II. But everybody now says they have a social justice mission. So it's kind of hard to be distinctive as you try to bring students in and say, this is the place that can make a difference and make a difference in your life, like it made a difference in so many of our alumni.
I mean, I guess one thing I would say, just as somebody who teaches here, is that one way I do think it is different is that I think there's a stronger commitment among the students and faculty to activism than there perhaps is in other places. And again, there's plenty of other universities where there are people who do both, but I think here it's been pretty consistent. I would say, you know, in terms of how difficult it is over time, you know, the system of higher education is different from what it was previously. And so I think that sometimes does put some barriers, I think, in front of universities when they're trying to do the right thing. So that's a really good question.
But let me add that, you know, Roosevelt has changed its focus in various times. Sometimes we were emphasizing older returning adults,
right?
Where we were one of the first. to recognize that and to have courses that met their needs. We've had great work done with students with disabilities, another and many others.
Yeah, that's a good point. So James is asking a question. It says, you taught at Roosevelt for a long time. What do you think makes Roosevelt special or different from other universities? So I guess that's a bit of a follow-up to what we were just talking about.
I'll tell you, when I was a dean, I hired a lot of people who had other choices, but they really resonated with our mission. And we have a great faculty, we have a great staff. People are really committed. It's hard, financially. Roosevelt started with 0 endowment. And that whole Little Red Schoolhouse thing really hurt us in the 50s and early 60s too. So that's always been a struggle. We don't have the deep pockets of many of the other universities in Chicago, but we have very generous alumni and other donors who've made a difference, with their donations. But I think Roosevelt also has, even though we have slightly larger classes than we used to, we still have much smaller classes than many universities and a lot of attention to students.
Sorry about that ding. So a question here from David Pomerantz. He asks, what motivated you to work for Roosevelt University? I was drawn to it by the social justice mission, and he says he was a sustainability studies major.
Oh, what was his question?
Just what motivated you to come work for Roosevelt University?
Well, you may remember how hard it was to get a job in history anywhere. Although I was actually in a position at Northwestern when this position opened up, and I had always heard of Roosevelt. Always. When I first moved here, I went to see 2 things. I went to see Hull House and I went to see Roosevelt because somehow I knew about its mission. So I was very excited to come and be a part of that. And also I love the students. Students are terrific.
Yeah. I think that, as I said, Lynn definitely is drawn to the mission and has worked really hard to maintain it over the years, for sure. I had a question for you, which is kind of more of a softball question, but I know that you're really close to all of this research. You've been doing it for quite some time, but can you think of something that really surprised you when you were digging into the university's history?
A number of things. The inclusion of Japanese students took me greatly by surprise, and I only learned about it when I first saw that one photograph. Then I started talking to some of the old timers. I interviewed a lot of them, and I learned that story. So that was a surprise to me. And of course, President Sparling was a member of the American Friends Service Committee, which was heavily involved in trying to help the people from the internment camps. So that was one surprise. I think the nature of the activism in the 1940s and 50s surprised me too. I just learned about the Red Cross issue probably about 6 months ago, and that was amazing to learn that story.
Where do you think that Sparling's sense of social justice came from? Do you know much about his biography? Like what?
He was an idealist. He was an idealist from the very beginning. Actually, Chuck Middleton and I visited his family in New York a few years ago, and he was just I'm not sure where it came from. He was also talking to some of the old timers, sometimes hard to work with. He could be very dogmatic, but he had a deep and abiding sense of what the university should be. And then you've got to realize when he walked out and when those 62 faculty and staff walked out, they didn't have any jobs. They didn't have any money. They had mortgages, they had families. It took a lot of guts to do what they did at that time.
Yeah, I was thinking about how courageous that was. That really is remarkable. Julius Rhodes asks a question. As Roosevelt continues to move forward, how will it expand its mission and accessibility, which is it's a real issue today?
That's a great question. Higher education is going to be facing some huge changes, kind of accelerated by the pandemic, I would say. But I think the inclusion of Robert Morris brings us a whole new array of courses, and it'll be great to integrate those with the more comprehensive liberal arts ones that we have now. I would hope lots of history classes, Margie, and it's hard to read the tea leaves, but I think there's a place for Roosevelt in the future world of higher education for sure.
All right, one final question, and I think we'll sort of close out here from Susan. How is Roosevelt responding to current events such as the Black Lives Matter movement? You had that one slide of the protests.
Yeah, I didn't originally have that slide, but I did a program for orientation this year, and the students immediately said, where current protests? And I hadn't even thought of them. So thank you to the students. Well, President Ali makes statements on behalf of the university all the time on contemporary issues. He always has, and so have various colleges. And I think you see part of the response in our curriculum, in teaching, and in this conference, in the American Dream Conference, which addresses issues that are front and center right now for all Americans.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think the response is unfolding. It's not, it's not finished. It's an ongoing issue that has to be addressed. I just wanted to mention to you too that in the comments on YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn, there are lots of people just saying hello. Big shout out to you, Lynn.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's really nice. I just wanted to end actually with a little story that involves you as well, and that is my initial move to Roosevelt in 26 years ago. When I walked into the building, and I think you took me up to the 7th floor and showed me the office that I would be using. And I was actually sharing an office with Leon Stein. And we opened the door, and there was a big wooden desk, and then a small wooden desk, and a little wooden chair, and then a rotary phone. And where you couldn't leave any voicemail. So that was actually interesting, because I was like, well, I don't have to answer voicemail. And then I asked for a bookcase, and you were so funny. You were like, oh yeah, for sure, you can go down in the basement. Just contact Physical Plant, and they'll take you down there, and you can root through the old furniture. And so what I wanted to say about that to our audience this evening is that I think Lynn mentioned this earlier, but Roosevelt has been a resource poor institution. And the only reason that we have been able to really maintain ourselves and to flourish is because of your generosity, and the generosity of alums and people, friends of the university, who are just inspired by what our alumni do and what the university stands for. We started the Black Student Equity Fund this summer, and there are many other just, very worthy places if you have a few dollars to give to the university. And I will say that I am constantly in awe of our students and the barriers that they face and the way that they persevere to get their degrees and to go out and do good work in this world. And so I just want to thank everybody who supports the university for doing that. And I think if you want to have the last word, Lynn, we can wrap up. But I just want to thank you for a really inspiring presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I don't think there's a lot of universities that have as rich and inspiring a history as Roosevelt. So it's been a lot of fun to look into it and share it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for telling that story.